So yeah, to start off our discussion of Nietzsche, I think the best way to introduce him is by noting that he is renowned for his uncompromising criticism of conventional morality. He famously proclaimed, "God is dead," a very provocative sentence, especially in his time, the 19th century. He wrote and lived in Germany, traveled and worked elsewhere throughout Europe. But with that statement, "God is dead," subject to a wide range of interpretation, he seemed to be raising the question of what it means to live in a world without valid religion or genuine religious feelings. So, a key question for Nietzsche was, how can human beings live in a world without God? And we'll talk a bit about his answer today. Nietzsche also called himself a psychologist, and that was well before the field was very far advanced. Many of his observations about human nature bear a strong resemblance to those of Freud, which will hopefully come into focus during the second half of class when we talk about Freud's work, Civilization and Its Discontents today. Another thing I always like to point out about Nietzsche is that he was a major influence on artists, both during his time and pretty much ever since. He was passionate about music and poetry. He wrote his own poems and musical compositions. I also get the impression reading Nietzsche that he seemed to think much of the meaning of life could be learned through close study of major texts. He himself was an expert on Greek and Roman literature. He was what was called a philologist in his day. And part of his project of attacking and trying to find an alternative for his day's moral philosophy was analyzing language to uncover philosophical truths. So that'll be another theme from Nietzsche that we're going to talk about today. But I think above all, Nietzsche wrote about philosophy not as a speculative practice, but as a way of life. And along with the fact that he was just a brilliant writer, that approach may be why he is widely read to this day. So with that, I'm going to fire up the slides. You can bear with me a moment.
Sorry, I forgot. Thank you so much for taking I figured you yeah, thank you so much.
So hopefully everyone can see the slides. So Nietzsche's life's work really can be seen as both an attack on Christian values and at the same time as a search for alternative values. So part of the reading for today with the many of the readings for today come from one of his later books called Beyond Good and Evil, in which he tried to find a new system of values beyond conventional notions of those two concepts, good and evil. And like I was starting to say, a lot of his work consisted of analyzing and unearthing what those terms really meant. So a key focus for him, I think, comes up in the selections for today, was the idea of nobility. So hopefully something that also becomes pretty clear pretty early on in the reading is that Nietzsche, who actually happened to be descended on both sides of his family from Christian, I believe, Lutheran ministers, is very much reacting against the Christian morality of his time. That's a morality that, I mean, there's lots of different denominations within Christianity, but maybe one thing that they have in common is a message that Christ preaches in the Bible that the meek shall inherit the earth, a sort of exaltation and praise of the kind of weakest, most neglected members of society, with an implication that the strong and the powerful are in fact sinful. Nietzsche hated that morality. So in the excerpt for today, What is Noble, he sketches a radical notion of culture and nobility. He'll argue that nobility is closely associated with savagery, and that the best parts of culture come from strong classes preying upon the weak. And he goes so far as to state that the purpose of the weak is to serve the strong. So this will be a complete inversion, really, of the moral systems that we've discussed so far. I think to give a taste of this sort of very radical, almost violent perspective Nietzsche has, I mean, throughout the reading, if you had a chance to do it, we get this kind of praise of seemingly brutal aspects of human nature. Nietzsche speaks positively about the ruling class's nonchalance and contempt for safety, body, life, and comfort, their awful joy and intense delight in all destruction and all the ecstasies of victory and cruelty. So he seems to be sketching a totally new radical idea of what is praiseworthy in society and in life. Elsewhere in the reading, he states, life itself is essentially appropriation, injury, conquest of the strange and weak, suppression, severity, obtrusion of peculiar forms, incorporation, exploitation. He also states, a good and healthy aristocracy should accept with a good conscience the sacrifice of a legion of individuals who, for its sake, must be suppressed and reduced to imperfect men, to slaves and instruments. So if we pause and stick with this one phrase from early on in the reading for today, is there anything that this reminds you of from the previous moral thinkers we've discussed so far?
He is more of a, it's like a Darwinistic sense of morality and stuff.
Well, that's a great topic, comparing and contrasting Nietzsche and Darwin. I mean, I get a similar impression that Nietzsche seems to be describing reality as a violent competitive realm that is reminiscent of Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest. But Nietzsche will also, a little bit in the writing, the excerpts for today, but in his other works, kind of fight against some of the core ideas of Darwin. He's looking for something beyond just the struggle for existence to base his philosophy on. But it's a great it's a great point that you're making, and I think we'll have to ask ourselves if Nietzsche and Darwin do seem to agree on some of the basics about how reality or about how nature work. Does Nietzsche offer a persuasive alternative to a Darwinist view that existence is nothing but struggle to survive? Because Nietzsche will suggest something more, which we'll get to in a little bit. Maya put in the text Machiavelli. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's also a lot of similarities between Nietzsche and Machiavelli. I mean, Machiavelli, who we talked about a few weeks ago, thinks of politics in particular as a realm of seemingly endless conflict. And just the terms Nietzsche is using to describe humanity here are very much kind of a vocabulary of not just conflict, but actually violence. So I would say, though, that maybe a difference, I mean, we could talk all day about comparing Nietzsche and Machiavelli. Well, Machiavelli largely sticks to political philosophy, and there's definitely political implications for Nietzsche's thought. He's actually, I would say, trying to go deeper than Machiavelli and understand human nature and really all of reality on a very fundamental level, taking a kind of moral perspective to those realms in a way that Machiavelli kind of shies away from, because he's so interested in sort of political calculus and how rulers can advance one another. Nietzsche is trying to go deeper than that, but that's also a great comparison, I would say. I also want to touch on in passing, because it sometimes comes up, Nietzsche is presenting these kind of bombshell generalities about what quote unquote life itself is and what human nature is, starting by focusing on this kind of vague idea of aristocracy or ruling classes. So what sometimes comes up is, even if you are inclined to think that's all well and good, Nietzsche, that sort of makes sense. How did you come to these conclusions? I think we get a small taste of his method early on in the text when he states, one must think profoundly to the very basis and resist all sentimental weakness. And that's the sort of clause that he prefaces this quote on life is essentially appropriation. So it seems like there's a both meditative and kind of psychological project built into Nietzsche's moral philosophy. He's urging readers and presumably himself to resist all sentimental weakness, tear aside, don't take for granted the morality, specifically for Nietzsche, the Christian morality that you may have grown up with, but think profoundly on human nature and the nature of reality. And he seems to think that if you do that, it will lead you to sort of see and maybe even embrace the very cruel nature of humanity and the rest of reality. He goes on to articulate that cruel nature in terms of classes or types of morality, master morality and slave morality, what I think is a deliberately provocative phrase on his part. But before we even get to that, you all tell me any initial reactions you had while reading this or had while discussing this now to Nietzsche's kind of bombshell assertions he's giving us that life itself is essentially appropriation, injury, conquest, etc. And that a good and healthy aristocracy, a good and healthy ruling class should accept the sacrifice of what Nietzsche would consider their inferiors. I mean, this is so anti-democratic that I think it should shock us. But is there any reason, does anyone agree or disagree at this point? And it's perfectly fine also to be on the fence.
I just feel like it sounds like just making like some sort of like justification of like why bad things should happen. Not like any society.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. Nietzsche's not only justifying bad things happening in society, but and if by bad, I mean, I sort of take you to be using the word that the way I would be inclined to use it, acts like appropriation, injury, conquest of the weak.
Yeah.
I would think of those as bad, but Nietzsche is starting to depict that those can actually be good things. And so what good and bad mean, he will end up sort of radically turning on their head. One other thing before getting to so-called master morality and so-called slave morality that I wanted to point out with this last passage is, I mean, I think Nietzsche in general bears a lot of resemblance to both Darwin and to Machiavelli, as you, Alan and Maya, were saying. But I think this is also a allusion to Kant and his concept of duty-based morality, specifically the second formulation of the categorical imperative. So anyone who off the top of their head can kind of share or paraphrase what that second formulation of the categorical imperative was? Maya, please.
I think that was the one about sort of not using people as means, but treating them as ends in themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what I was looking for. I mean, my paraphrase, I don't have the text in front of me, is something like treat all of humanity as much in your own person as in others, always as an end and never merely as a means. Another way to put it would be always treat human beings as being for the sake of themselves and not for the sake of oneself. Don't use, appropriate, injure them. Nietzsche is saying the exact opposite of that right here, that a good and healthy aristocracy or ruling class does in fact view the weak, the subordinate, as being for the sake of the aristocracy or ruling class. So we should be asking ourselves, what on earth would make Nietzsche state that? So this is part of, hopefully kind of illustrates how Nietzsche is simultaneously, I think very artfully, launching an attack on conventional morality, specifically Christian morality in this case, and he's an ultra educated philosopher and linguist. I think he does have Kant in mind here. And at the same time, and he's doing that attack at the same time that he's kind of weaving or creating a new picture of morality on his own. So I just want to point out, for getting into so-called master and slave morality, a persistent literary attribute of Nietzsche's philosophy. I mean, I would say he's as much a great author of literature as he is a great thinker, in my opinion. And I mean, there's even small turns of phrase that you can pick up on, even in as short couple of selections as we have for today, that give a taste of that. So he prefaces his discussion of so-called master and slave morality by saying he arrived at that theory by first taking, quote unquote, a tour through the finer and coarser moralities which have hitherto prevailed or still prevail on the earth. And what I find, especially literary and also radical at the same time, is that this seemingly innocent phrase, I think, it is full of a sort of Nietzschean attitude toward morality. He's talking about morality, schools of thought about the things that are nearest and dearest to human beings, the way that a connoisseur would be talking about art. So it's this almost aesthetic perspective, again, a tour through finer and coarser moralities that he's applying to seemingly really important questions about good or evil. I mean, I think when he phrases things that way, he's not trying to be frivolous, but among other things, he's kind of creating distance between himself as an author, us as his readers, and the kind of taboo topics or the sacred cows, the things we take for granted also from conventional morality. And I'll also mention that it's around this same passage that, after Nietzsche very subtly and summarily attacks Kant, that he slips in a subtle, severe attack against Mill. But maybe we can get to that in a few moments. Master morality and slave morality, it's the latter term that he'll assign to the contemporary Christian infused morality of his day, with definitely strong negative polemical connotation. But before going into what Nietzsche says about those two types of morality and his understanding of them in terms of how they use the words good and bad or good and evil, maybe we can pause and ask ourselves, what do these terms mean to us? Good and bad or good and evil? And also, how do we know how to use them? Yes, Maya, please.
To me, bad versus evil. Evil has sort of a more like permanent connotation and almost a supernatural connotation. Um, whereas bad might be, something you do. I guess evil feels more like something you are.
Yeah. I like your characterization of evil as kind of evoking the supernatural. I mean, I think that takes us close to Nietzsche's understanding of the term. And yeah, there's also an idea that maybe, if I understood you correctly, Maya, that bad might be something that we ascribe or attribute to an action. Good people do bad things, for instance, but evil seems to suggest like a permanent state of malignancy. I see in the chat. Yes, thank you, Edwin. Any other thoughts? But I mean, kind of tangentially, how often do we use the term evil nowadays?
I don't know when like I guess someone's I wouldn't say like I guess the best way I can really explain is like sort of acting out of social norms or something.
Acting out of,
Like social norms, but like with the intent to like actually harm someone.
yeah, we would tend to reject something as evil if it seems deliberate. But is it also the case that if there are sort of extenuating circumstances, explanations,
Yeah.
then we'd shy away from using that term? Can you think of any examples? Can you, Alan, or anyone else think of examples of what's the last time you saw something that you would be willing to call evil?
War, really.
Sure. I mean, war is a classic example. I mean, in a philosophical context or a political science context, a lot of times people debate, are there just and unjust wars? But sure, you could also ask, is war in and of itself always evil?
I guess also with I guess there is some like differentiation to it, but like with like animal abuse and stuff.
With what?
Like animal abuse. Or
Sure.
just really any type of abuse.
Yeah, I mean, abusing the vulnerable,
Yeah.
animals, children, others, does seem especially bad, even evil. Maya, I see your hand is raised.
Um, for me, I think the last thing I really thought like, wow, that's evil. So I fell down kind of a Wikipedia hole on anti-vax stuff and Andrew Wakefield. And I guess for people who don't know, Andrew Wakefield was kind of the first doctor to push anti-vax stuff, and he was doing it for money, basically. He had an alternative vaccine that he was trying to say was much safer than the vaccine that he was questioning, and he was trying to sell that.
Right.
So to me, like, I think it's bad when people don't like vaccinate their kids, but I think it's evil if you're pushing anti-vax stuff on parents for money.
Yeah.
Isn't he the guy who like first pushed like vaccines giving autism and stuff?
Yeah, that's him.
Uh
Got it. Yeah. No, thanks for showing that. I'm actually not familiar with Andrew Wakefield, but what you're saying, Maya, reminds me a bit of, I think it complements what Alan was saying, that something about deliberately and knowingly doing harm takes something from the category of merely bad to being actual evil, intentional malice. I think let's keep all these examples in mind and ask ourselves whether they fit which category of morality, according to Nietzsche, they fit into. So early on in the reading for today, he sets up this ideal of nobility that embodies and embraces life as appropriation, injury, exploitation, and use of the weak. And then to kind of set up a contrast and continue his attack on conventional morality, he explores and gives a theory of how this ideal, noble, aristocratic ruling class uses the terms good and bad and then compares them to the opposite kind of morality that uses different terminology. So to start with so-called master morality, in that system, values, moral values, come from the individual themselves. And that individual glories in themselves. He honors whatever he recognizes in himself. Such morality is self-glorification. This person exhibits faith in oneself, pride in oneself, quote, a radical enmity and irony toward quote unquote selflessness. And essentially, as a strong individual, as a strong class, takes oneself to be the standard and definition of the term good. And so in that sense, that's how the school of thought of master morality generates values. It looks to the strong and states that the essence of the strong is what determines something to be good, and considers the quote unquote bad almost as a kind of afterthought. It's whatever is not strong and good. It doesn't so much reject the quote unquote bad as evil. There's not that highly morally charged terminology that Nietzsche attributes to conventional Christian morality. It's more like an attitude while exploiting and manipulating the weak, but also showing a sort of condescension. Master morality the adherent to master morality would hold, I am strong, beautiful, good, all of these other positive things. And the opposite of those, weak and ugly, is not so much a morally charged evil as it is something to be shunned, to be looked down upon. And the way that a system of values, according to Nietzsche, follows from this is, if a core moral tenet is kind of equating strength with goodness, that shapes traditional moral questions like who one has duty to. And if you're strong and an adherent of so-called master morality, according to Nietzsche, and you disdain the weak, you look down on them, of course you have no duties to the weak. You have duties only to your equals, according to Nietzsche. And he takes it further because he seems to view reality as a highly violent, competitive, kind of Darwinian, kind of Machiavellian realm. And part of the attainment of glory that so-called master morality is interested in requires the strong to have, quote unquote, a certain necessity to have enemies. So that's master morality, which uses the terms good versus bad instead of good versus evil, and takes the strong as the point of departure for the establishment of values. So-called slave morality, a provocative, possibly offensive term, has the opposite point of departure. It takes the perspective of the weak as the norm. Nietzsche writes that the slave has an unfavorable eye for the virtues of the powerful. He has a skepticism and distrust, a refinement of distrust of everything, quote unquote, good that is there, i.e., by the strong honored. So this kind of morality starts out not by celebrating itself, but by really hating and fearing what's different, namely the strong. And it's through that attitude of fear and hatred that these host of values such as sympathy arise. The weak, according to Nietzsche, value sympathy really because they have no other choice. It is here that sympathy, the kind helping hand, the warm heart, patience, diligence, humility, and friendliness attain their honor. So all of these beautiful terms that in Nietzsche's time, and I think to a great extent up to today, are really valued, whether in a formal moral school of philosophy or not. Nietzsche is saying he's unearthing the real motivation for them, which according to him is a kind of resentment of the weak against the powerful that leads to cultivating these attributes or desiring, praising these attributes that in a way defend the weak from the powerful. It's like, of course, it would seem, I think Nietzsche would say, much more convenient and easy for the weak to value sympathy than, and seek help, be in a position to receive pity than the strong. The strong, according to Nietzsche, do not want to be pitied. And here's where, after in our readings, Nietzsche, having attacked Kantian morality, duty-based morality, by stating that it is good for the strong to treat the weak as a means to attaining the strong's goals, the goals of the strong, Nietzsche goes on the attack against utilitarianism, I think. It's a school of thought he would have been familiar with. And, in the same passage where he states, sympathy, the kind helping hand, the warm heart, attain honor in so-called slave morality, he elaborates that slave morality is essentially the morality of utility. And he doesn't spell it out much more than that. Maybe I could pause for a moment and ask both, does all of this make sense so far, that kind of distinction between two types of morality and how they use terms? I haven't quite finished talking about how quote unquote slave morality uses good versus evil, but does this make sense so far? And if anyone can spell out how quote unquote slave morality, according to Nietzsche, is quote unquote essentially the morality of utility, I would be interested in that. Yes, Maya.
It sounds to me like he's kind of saying, like, the reason that these traits are valued by people who have slave moral system would be because it benefits them. So like they would say a person is good when they're sympathetic, when they're kind, when they're friendly, because it benefits them. So I guess that would be the utility of it.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. Slave morality, according to Nietzsche, starts from a place of fear, and then it develops values, but very seemingly self-centered ones, and usefulness becomes a touchstone of moral value, according to this type of morality. Evelyn, I see your hand is raised.
It sounds really narcissistic too. Like, like labeling, like, yeah, you did that. It doesn't really like explain much of, like it doesn't go deeper, I think, on explaining that division that is between those groups that he's comparing. I mean, and the thing is that the people that he says like are in charge, the powerful ones, are the one that have created that system. So it's like you disable these people. So how can you say that you're strong if you're disabling people to use them? So you're already like, I don't know, it's kind of like an oxymoron, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've hit on a major complication that happens in the sort of history of morality according to Nietzsche. And I think he does intend his description of the types of morality to represent real historical developments. I mean, the complication that comes up is when so-called slave morality becomes the dominant morality, and it becomes the ruling class, not in the spiritual sense of quote unquote master morality, but the actual real world ruling class that holds office, that rules the economy, et cetera, et cetera. You know, they start to use terms that might come from utilitarianism or Kantian moral philosophy, for that matter, and it's a tricky development to track when so-called the morality of the weak becomes advocated by those who are in fact strong. So
It's like what's that comic's name that died like way back when? It was like with like the term terrorist, the term like freedom fighter, or like it really depends on the context of what it's being used in.
yeah, I
Or
mean, I think
like,
there's some similarity there. I don't know. Do you mean George Carlin? It seems like
yes, yeah.
kind of thing. Sure. Yeah.
Or like how Mandela was considered like a terrorist for like what 30 or so years,
Sure.
even though he would be considered really a freedom fighter or
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think,
a revolutionary, really.
yeah, those examples to me sort of suggest that, you know, being a hero or a villain is in the eye of the beholder. Because I think what George Carlin was trying to get at, I think there's a lot of agreement between that and what Nietzsche is spelling out here. The difference being, I mean, you know, the similarity being that hero versus terrorist is a matter of perspective. Whether strong and weak are good and bad or good and evil is a matter of perspective. But I think what Nietzsche is trying to do is, you know, get beyond a kind of relativism over whether it's what strong and weak mean, to firmly establish that there is actually one definition, which he'll build up to, for moral values, and that strong is objectively good. Does that sort of make sense?
Isn't that like the what's that saying? Might makes right, sort of thing.
I think that so-called master morality, according to Nietzsche, would absolutely accept that point of view, which I don't especially agree with. But I think the Nietzsche has some very valid points, in my opinion, about the moral philosophy of his day, and even up until recently. Another way of understanding the difference between so-called master morality and so-called slave morality that Nietzsche provides is how they handle the idea of fear. In so-called master morality, the good man inspires fear, but in so-called slave morality, the evil man inspires fear. And so that brings us back a bit to the terms that each type of morality uses. Again, so-called master morality took itself, the strong in master morality, the strong take themselves to be good, and the weak are this kind of afterthought that they apply the label bad to. So-called slave morality, having taken its point of departure as fear of the strong, starts out by applying that morally charged word evil to the strong, saying that it is wrong to do appropriation, exploitation, injury to the weak. And from there, sets up a moral idea of good to cover all the kind of psychological defense mechanisms that come from fearing the strong: sympathy, the kind helping hand, the warm heart, utilitarianism, become the idea of good. But again, it's a type of moral thought that is rooted in fear and hatred of the strong, the so-called evil. Evelyn, I see your hand is raised.
So that when he says that utility, I mean the thing is that, for example, I mean when you're a slave, it's not like you choose to be a slave. You were turned into a slave. So the fact that he said, for example, slaves are they fear you and they're gonna do this for you. No, you're making them do it for you. It's not like it comes out of their heart. It's like you're making them do it by force, not because of willingness. So I'm kind of having a little like where he says slave morality, because there's no morality in there. Like it's like you it's like having like you making these people and they don't do it, you can do whatever you want with them. They're disposable to you. So I'm having a like, ugh.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a totally valid, I think, reaction to this. I think Nietzsche is being deliberately provocative and arguably obnoxious with this terminology, and we should not let him off easy for describing conventional morality as so-called slave morality. As you point out, Evelyn, one of many issues is that real historical people who were enslaved didn't choose that. Is definitely not the case. And since the end of slavery in much of the world, people who are still, poor, deprived of opportunity, exploited by wealthy classes, did not choose to be there. And I mean, in a way, you could just end the discussion there and say, sorry, Nietzsche, I am not interested in picking on the weak, which is what, or the vulnerable, which is what, in a certain light, I think what you were getting, Evelyn, Nietzsche seems to be doing. But a way I think that I would say redeems Nietzsche's view, but I mean, what really gives Nietzsche's view substance to me is, I think what he has in mind are not so much real historical examples of enslaved people or a lower economic class in his own time or anything like that. What he has in mind are Christians and Christianity. And he's saying that Christianity has, from the origin, adopted the perspective very explicitly, starting with a Sermon on the Mount attributed to Christ, adopted the perspective of the weak and championed the weak and, sprouted up, led to the cropping up of all of these values that praise the weak. And what Nietzsche's trying to do here is show, first of all, how these Christian conventional moral values are actually rooted in valuing the weak, and also arguing that that is against what Nietzsche would call the natural order, that the real world, this kind of Machiavellian, kind of Darwinist world, is all about expropriation, exploitation, conquest, and it's somehow an unnatural development that Christianity has pulled off by flipping things on their head and making the weak the touchstone for morality. So it's kind of long-winded answer to what you're saying, because I strongly appreciate your sort of issue with Nietzsche's idea of slave morality here. But does that make sense?
Yeah, also, like, for example, when he says weak, like when I think of like a person of a slave, the last word that I can think of is weak, especially when that person's labor is literally the reason why you're in power. So it's like it's really it doesn't make a lot of sense. But I guess probably he was talking, from his time and probably his social status and all of that. So it didn't affect him, I guess.
No, I mean that, I think that is I agree with that criticism. I mean, his vocabulary is extremely problematic. But maybe another example would be, maybe it was a little convoluted with trying to spell out how slave morality to Nietzsche is Christian morality. To take a more specific example, the kind of person he's really targeting a lot of the time is not, I don't think, the most disadvantaged member of societies, but more someone like a John Stuart Mill or an Immanuel Kant, or basically, let's toss in some Marxist terminology, the bourgeoisie, who have come, in Nietzsche's view, to comfort themselves by stating that they take pity on the weak. You have to show sympathy toward the weak, and ascribe to this whole kind of galaxy of associated moral values. Nietzsche, part of what Nietzsche is doing, I think, is showing that there's a real hypocrisy to a John Stuart Mill, and maybe even to a Kant, and definitely to like the average churchgoer. And he's viciously attacking them by using this very provocative terminology. But like I said, we don't need to let Nietzsche off the hook. I mean, he's not necessarily right about any of this. I do think at a minimum, though, that his very harsh criticism of conventional Christian morality does bring out some potential weaknesses in it. And so, Alan, yes.
I was gonna say that sounds just like a bit what I said earlier. It's just him trying to justify, I guess, like you said, the bourgeoisie, like I guess maintaining power in a sense.
Yeah, I mean it's tricky. I mean, yeah, I think it's so. According to, I think, like a sort of history of morality, according to Nietzsche, would be that in pre-Christian times, there was something like the master morality that he sketches in reality. And it was after Christianity that, and in that morality, the strong are valued and praised and the weak are rejected. In post-Christian times, a new moral system comes up that values the weak and hates the strong. What complicates things is that by the time Christianity has sort of spread, according to Nietzsche, the ruling classes themselves, like the people with actual power in politics, in the economy, in whatever, have come to accept the so-called slave morality that takes the quote unquote weak as the standard of moral value. And that comes up a little bit toward the end of the read. I'll get to you in 1 second, Maya. I mean, I think on the last page, he relates that, the human being has become, in a sense, stunted, amputated by having even strong people ascribe to the morality of the weak. I mean, he says, what produces today a repulsion towards quote unquote man, for we suffer from man. There's no doubt about it. It is not fear. It is rather that we have nothing more to fear from men. It is that the worm man is in the foreground and pullulates. It is that the tame man, the wretched, mediocre, and unedifying creature, has learnt to consider himself a goal and a pinnacle, an inner meaning, an historic principle. So he's saying that what Christianity has, in a sense, warped morality into making the ones who should be strong this actual kind of sad specimen that is now ashamed of strength, and has all these values of pity and compassion that come from so-called slave morality. Does that sort of make sense?
I understand.
Yeah.
Okay. And we don't have to agree with any of it, but this is just my interpretation. But Maya, I saw your hand raised a moment ago.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking in the context of like colonialism. Does he think that yeah, I guess Christian or slave morality sort of being forced on people around the world? It feels like maybe, yeah, it might make a populace kind of easier to subjugate if they value I guess weakness or kindness than if they're all sort of following the the master morality of yeah.
Oh no, I mean I think that's a great question for Nietzsche. How, if we are willing to entertain this distinction between master and slave morality, how would we apply it to, the history of, say, European colonization of the rest of the world? And that gets to be tricky for me because I mean, a Christian, more, there's so many ways you can approach it. I mean, one approach would be, I happen to have read a little bit about this, that so when you looked at Spain coming to the Americas, there were actual members of the clergy, Christians, who thought what the so-called conquistadors were doing in the Americas was pure evil and totally unchristian and totally hypocritical on the one hand. But on the other hand, the conquistadors, right, they claimed to be spreading Christianity, and there's a totally different interpretation in which that dissemination of Christianity enabled further exploitation of the subject people. So it's very complicated to me, and but I think it's a great question that you raised. Evelyn, I see your hand is raised.
The thing about the master morality that I see on Nietzsche that he depicts is like having a mask. The thing is that it doesn't show character or personality. It only shows like an act that you keep outside for the society to see. So it's like doesn't sound genuine at all. It's like, you gotta act this way so people can think you are this. It's like putting like a mask over you or the real you. While the slave morality is more like, being, more humane, like expressing your emotion and letting it out. While the master morality, it kind of like holds that back and he's putting like a total different stuff out there. And personification that is not like, like humans. It holds back the human part. So I'm having trouble with that part.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Nietzsche would disagree. And his argument is that so-called slave morality, the conventional Christian morality, is actually what masks human nature. And he thinks that master morality brings the strong, at least, closer to an honest version of human nature, and kind of ties into the question of who does Nietzsche really have in mind when he's talking about master morality. I think that it is very clear that Nietzsche intends so-called slave morality to apply to Christianity itself and any kind of Christian influenced moral philosophy, including those of Kant and John Stuart Mill. Master morality is much trickier because even though it sounds like, in the reading for today and in, many other books by Nietzsche, he seems to have in mind some historic examples. I mean, he talks about how the French aristocracy embodied the corruption of so-called master morality. There are other, toward the end of the reading, he talks about Vikings and aristocratic classes from across the world. I mean, those are really vague to me and definitely historically dubious. It's in other works that Nietzsche seems to suggest his vision of a future master morality is really about kind of special, incredibly endowed examples of humanity. And the term he applies for that is something not in the reading for today, but just to kind of quickly familiarize ourselves with, is the Übermensch, German term often translated to Superman or Overman. But before I say anything about that, Alan, I see your hand is raised.
It was in regards to, I guess, what you and Evelyn were talking about, where like you could, like, a lot of times, like, people in charge would sort of lie about their morality, and it sort of reminds me of like two things like post World War II where there were, like, the what is it, what's the Nostrum Accords or whatever,
The which accords?
like the one post World War II where they like tried a bunch of like uh like Nazi like generals, tenets and stuff.
Oh, I mean, the most famous, I think, trial is, I mean, the Nuremberg trials was where,
Yeah.
where the surviving Nazi leaders were tried. Yeah.
But yeah,
Was
but
that
at the
wrong?
same it was one of those, but like at the same time you have like, like Operation Paperclip where they would charge those same Nazis for like crimes against humanity, but at the same time hire those Nazis for like for I guess putting them into like intelligence departments.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not super familiar with that. I'm like sort of vaguely familiar, but how would you bring Nietzsche into the picture with that?
We're like I forget which one. I'm like still like not really getting which is which with like mass morality and stuff. But where one of them is like I don't know, you have to like sort of put up a front. It was one of them. It was one of them that Evelyn was talking about where like a lot of times they would just put up a front
Sure.
to like show that they're being moral, so to speak.
Yeah. Okay. I think I get what you mean. Yes. I think that those, so like the Allies kind of making deals with actual Nazis, whether they were scientists or other kinds of experts after World War II ended, to the extent I'm familiar with it, would seem to exemplify the kind of mixing of the two types of morality according to Nietzsche. I mean, all these examples, I mean, we could apply Nietzsche in very different ways. I mean, with colonialism, it's very hard for me to discern which is Nietzschean master morality, which is Nietzschean slave morality. I mean, I think with what you're just talking about, Alan, the hypocrisy there would seem to be, in Nietzsche's terms, maybe master morality disguising itself as slave morality, and then trying to accomplish what master morality wants, like basically hypocritically pretending to hate and want to hold the Nazis to account for their horrible crimes, but then secretly using them. I think that would be complicated from a Nietzschean point of view, but I think that's a great example. It might make for a good paper if anyone's in the mood. But just sort of spell out a little bit more of this idea of master morality for Nietzsche, not in the reading for today, but in a book called Thus Spake Zarathustra, kind of puts the doctrine of the Übermensch, or the overman, in the mouth of a character called Zarathustra. And in that work, both continues Nietzsche's critique of conventional morality with a lot of very devastating sentences, such as, for all those much praised teachers of virtue, it's like looking at you, Kant, wisdom was the sleep without dreams. They knew no better meaning of life. This also reflects Nietzsche's, I think, very brilliant literary side. And Nietzsche also urges the creation of new values. So it's like after launching what I think is a very powerful criticism of Christian morality, Nietzsche doesn't stop there, but he seeks to form new values. And he constantly illustrates how difficult that is. Another very poetic passage: man is a rope tied between beast and overman. Possible allusion to Aristotle. A rope over an abyss, a dangerous across, a dangerous looking back, a dangerous shuddering and stopping. So this seems to be an exhortation for the strong to embrace master morality and create their values anew. And a question that I would ask if we had more time, though, is, if Nietzsche in this work is setting up almost an ideal of heroes that could inspire and embody master morality and create new values, that raises the question to me: who do we take heroes in our society today to be, and what do they say about our society? But maybe that could be kind of food for thought. So going back to the reading for today, I'm glad that it includes a passage that got the subtitle, The Madman and the Death of God, because I think that it shows that while Nietzsche was viciously critical of Christian morality, he didn't take Christianity lightly, and in fact seemed to feel a great sense of loss over what he viewed as sort of destruction of or inability to have faith in God as previous generations had. And it's this very, I'm not going to read all of this, but he gives a very vivid and somewhat poetic allegory almost of the loss of faith in his time. And it's another thing that I think makes Nietzsche an extremely modern author, is his not only personal atheism, but his appreciation of a decline in faith, at least in his own culture. And it's basically the passage, this very vivid description of a so-called madman who goes in search of God with a lantern during the daytime. Where is God gone? He called out. We have killed him, you and I. We are all his murderers. But how have we done it? How were we able to drink up the sea? And then, I mean, the rest of the passage shows to me how painful, according to Nietzsche, the loss of God would be. Creates a sense of confusion, a theme that will continue with the existentialist authors next week. What did we do when we loosened the earth from its sun? Is how serious the loss of God feels. Where does it now move? Whither do we move? Away from all suns? Do we not dash on unceasingly, backwards, sideways, forwards, in all directions? Is there still an above and below? Do we not stray as through infinite nothingness? God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we console ourselves, the most murderous of all murderers? So I think this shows again that Nietzsche, while on the one hand he is extremely critical of Christian morality, also appreciates loss of faith in his time as presenting a real crisis for humanity. It's like human beings have done something almost criminal by killing faith, by quote unquote killing God, but still, because he insists on the perspective, I think it's probably clear in the distinction between so-called master morality and so-called slave morality, that he is firmly in the camp of master morality because he wants to press that agenda. He'll say that as sad and confusing in ways as it is that God is quote unquote dead, he'll argue from the point of view of master morality or an Ubermensch that God's shadow, the after effects of God, also have to be vanquished. And he notes God is dead, but given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown, which I think is one of the things that makes Nietzsche very prescient. I mean, this would require a long digression, but I think that it's safe to say faith in many parts of the world has declined since the 19th century. But nevertheless, while Nietzsche was very aware of that decline, he kind of was able to foresee, almost prophecy, that the after effects of Christianity in particular would be with us for a long time. Because we're doing okay on time. I mean, the concluding note, I think, for this talk on Nietzsche is his theory of will to power as a kind of alternative, definitely to Christian morality, but also to Darwinism, which has come up a little bit. But all this stuff that I've just been saying, trying to paraphrase in ways, this passage is The Madman and the Death of God, where Nietzsche seems to be asserting faith is over, it's no longer possible. Does that sound right? If yes, why so? And if not, why not? I mean, I think one way to tackle this question would be reflecting just on our own experiences with religion. Like, I didn't have a religious upbringing, but I've been to church plenty of times. I've been to other houses of worship plenty of times.
So
Oh no, you can go.
okay, thank you. So for example, when I was growing up, I remember going to church with my grandma. And the reason why I went to church, it was, because she was, is this fear that give you, if you do something evil or stuff, you're gonna go to hell, hell and heaven. Okay, they put it like that. So I feel like most religion, I will agree with him. It's the fear of being punished after that and going to hell. But imagine if everybody, for example, became a superhero, let's say, in our minds. We wouldn't be scared of anything. So why would we go to church or have this spirituality if we're not afraid? So I can see both his point of view of saying, yes, humans, blah, 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 yeah, and we are very strong and la, 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 and then, but then we lose our faith. But then if you're like in the slavery morality thing, you're kind of afraid of everything. That's why you do the things that you do and think the way you do. So it's kind of like, it's like the yin yang, I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. If people lose faith, then what? I mean, this is not exactly what you're saying, but my takeaway is then what prevents them from going wild? But the other question I would have, though, Evelyn, is when you were at church as a child, okay, I mean, like many children, and I'm familiar with this experience, one goes out of fear of the consequences. Why do you think other people go, not just children? Or is it fear for everyone?
I mean, some people, for example, they feel like they're worshiping God and they feel good about it. It gave them some sense of peace. Others because it gave them a sense of belonging to a group, a community. So I think everybody goes there for different reasons. So yeah, for me at that time, of course, I was okay. I had to go because my grandma took me, so I didn't have the option to pull out. But now that I'm a grown up, there's different ways that I can, approach my beliefs, my spirituality, and for example, I don't say I'm an atheist person, but I think I believe in more like not in God, but more like a sense of spirituality approach. And I'll say I have fears. When you have common sense, you have fears because you are aware of the consequences. But I don't. For example, I cannot say I'm not afraid of death or going to hell or heaven. Like I don't go there. Like I don't believe in that. So yeah.
Got it. No, thanks for sharing that. Maybe as we wind down, can we go Alan and then Maya?
Oh, no, Maya had her hand up first, so
Okay.
go ahead.
I think yeah, I think religion, I mean, I'm kind of fascinated by cults. I was raised an atheist, so I'm just sort of like I watch a ton of like cult documentaries and stuff like that. I just find it fascinating. And I think the number one reason people wind up in cults is because they're looking for answers, and cults provide sort of an easy, black and white, simple answer to like the meaning of life and what you should do with your life. And I think kind of, yeah, even bigger religions can do that for people. They can give them a very easy, simple, black and white answer to the meaning of life. And I think, yeah, Nietzsche is kind of saying like, yeah, people might kind of freak out if they don't have those easy answers anymore.
Sure.
It's kind of terrifying to look at life and be like, yeah, I could be hit by a bus tomorrow. It's all chaos out there. So yeah, I mean, it does feel like you need something to replace the structure, I guess, that religion can give.
Yeah. I totally agree that once faith in God is undermined, it creates a crisis on an individual level and a social level. And another interesting thing is that you reminded me, once Nietzsche I'll speak for myself, once Nietzsche got in my head, I saw this critique of Christian morality everywhere, and as at least applicable to many situations where it's not immediately obvious. And I think cults would be a great example. I don't know if you saw Going Clear, the one about the Nixium cult. I think that's what it was called. It would be very possible to me to apply Nietzsche's concept of slave morality to the Nixium cult. And again, if you follow that sort of clinical diagnosis of slave morality through and see that it's, in Nietzsche's terms, non-sustainable, what happens then? Alan, yes.
Oh, and just to jump back off, I guess since we're still talking about like cults and stuff, until I guess also add on to what Evelyn was saying, like at least for religion, a lot of it generally has to do with like community and stuff. And some people just want to find like answers to some things they can never really get. And it's like why during like COVID you had like such an uptick, like a massive uptick of people like falling down like the QAnon like rabbit hole. Because a lot of them just assumed everything just like went to shit because of, like secret government like conspiracies. And like the only reason like they really fell into it really is because since everyone was so isolated, they had like, no sense of purpose or no sense of belonging since everyone was really by themselves.
Sure. Yeah. Bring it back to Nietzsche a bit. I mean, it seems like even though he's so negative about Christianity in particular, he very much acknowledges what seem to be fundamental, almost permanent human needs. And even if he diagnoses them in very critical terms, such as so-called slave morality, it seems like he did unearth something fundamental about human nature and its need either for community or, I mean, I think the way people responded to COVID, we could also put that in Nietzschean terms, that need for answers, an almost desperate need for answers. I don't have any of the answers, but I do want to briefly touch on the very end of the selections for today, where Nietzsche expresses his kind of alternative to Christianity in general, schools of Christian schools of moral thought like Kantianism and like utilitarianism in particular, as well as Darwinism, which Nietzsche spent his whole life, in a sense, fighting against. That's not explicit in this reading. And Nietzsche's proposal for a basis for a new and true moral philosophy that would kind of complement or cohere with so-called master morality is the so-called will to power. And it's a bit of a vague concept, and it's subject of a lot of debate since Nietzsche's day. But in a moral philosophy informed by the will to power, Nietzsche can state what is good, all that enhances the feeling of power, the will to power, and the power itself in man. What is bad, all that proceeds from weakness. What is happiness, the feeling that power is increasing, that resistance has been overcome. So a morality based on, or values based on will to power, which maybe arguably Nietzsche wants to transcend conventional morality, to go beyond good and evil in his phrasing. That would acknowledge that a living thing seeks above all to discharge its strength. Life itself is will to power. Self-preservation, this is a dig at Darwin, is only one of the indirect and frequent results. So power, according to Nietzsche, becomes the sort of foundational principle for not just humanity, but all of reality. But there are a lot of problems with it. Not only, even though the excerpt in the reading for today was pretty short, other places where he talks about the will to power also seem problematically vague. We might ask ourselves, what is power? And why would it be the fundamental principle of existence, according to Nietzsche? And how would you really base values on it? Does the idea of will to power really give you the basis to pass judgment on things, make moral decisions beyond just stating strong is good, weak is bad? In some other context, Nietzsche seems to be describing the will to power in a scientific or pseudo-scientific context, insisting that the cosmos does not so much consist of atoms, but of units of will to power. There are places where he sounds crazy. And I think there's always that kind of lurking in the background when reading Nietzsche, who actually was considered to have gone mad shortly before his death, that his philosophy was so extreme, tense, frenetic, that it's almost like that way madness lies. But I think at a minimum, he does give lots of food for thought about many values that we might otherwise take for granted. And last but not least, I mean, I'll just emphasize again that he is an extraordinary writer, and often a very poetic and moving one, who I think will always encourage us to question ourselves, question authority, question society. For instance, stating how to ruin a youth, how to ruin a student, instructs him to hold in high esteem only those who think like him. When I was getting ready for class today, I happened upon that, and that certainly struck a chord. We'll also write, whatever is done from love always occurs beyond good and evil, something for us to mull over, perhaps.